are a lot of eyes on Assassin's Creed Shadows. It has been embroiled in controversy since it was announced. The graphics, historical accuracy, and even collectible figurines have been scrutinized for being insensitive. Ubisoft has even responded, releasing multiple apologies for their missteps. I wish I could tell you that this preview of Assassin's Creed Shadows showed me that they've somehow beat all the odds, that it was a flawless masterpiece, or if it was a disaster, I would have told you the truth about what made it fall short. But I'd instead categorize what I've played as about what you'd expect from any other Assassin's Creed game, which may be great news for fans out there. What I played certainly wasn't a revolutionary entry into the Assassin's Creed franchise, but I do think I'll wind up enjoying the full game even more than what I played for this preview. The foundation is there for some interesting moments, but it does have some features I wish felt better. This preview was conducted on Ubisoft's streaming interface, which can introduce latency and impact visual clarity. When my footage was sent over, it looked much better than it did on the stream. These impressions are also from a build of the game that's incomplete. Some pretty simple things weren't functioning, like the photo mode, which I was prompted to try via an in-game suggestion, but couldn't because it wasn't set up yet. We were also jumped around a bit, which is always jarring as a new player. But I was given a second session, which gave me an opportunity to play again, and I enjoyed it a whole lot more the second time around. So I'm hopeful that concerns, like the fact that there wasn't a whole lot going on in the open world after completing the story missions, are simply because of how these vertical slice demos are made. With that setup about what I experienced, I did, however, want to start with a focus on the things I liked. I have plenty of critiques, but want to start off on some of the more positive notes. Ubisoft was kind enough to let me play in 2 sessions, meaning over 6 hours of gameplay. The added time allowed me to explore character dynamics between Naoe and Yasuke, and test features like Immersive mode, which uses period-appropriate languages. The Japanese voice acting stood out for its emotional depth compared to the English version. I very much preferred playing in Immersive mode. Here's a short look at a scene in English versus Japanese.
What should I tell Hideye?
What he needs to hear.
Tell him the truth. He will need to grow into the man he is meant to be.
八郎殿には何と?
ありのまま話すがよい。お家を継ぐ身ならば乗り越えられなくては。誠を申せ。
I preferred the Japanese read, but everyone will have their preference. Not only did I think the voice actors did a better job than their English counterparts, but it does help you feel like you're playing something that's a bit more faithful to the source material. There's also a canon mode you can select at the beginning of the game, which will allow you to opt out of dialogue options the game adds, and instead sit back and see how the story was supposed to unfold. I do like making choices though, even if they were unfortunately inconsequential in the demo build we played. Decide to kill someone, you kill them. Decide to spare someone, they still die in a minorly altered cutscene. I think it's great that Ubisoft added both immersion and canon mode to the menu though. Visually, there are moments when Shadows is really striking, and when compared to other recent Assassin's Creed games, I do think the graphics match up comparably. Climbing to the top of a structure to get that typical Assassin's Creed reveal hasn't really lost its appeal, and it's still a little gameplay treat every time you do it. But you seem to be required to complete the climbing part as Naoe, which is a critique I'll elaborate on later. Still, the highlight in that moment is the Himeji Castle's exterior, and when you go into the interior of the building, it's clear they spent a lot of time making these areas look pretty by adding a little details with lighting and objects that give you plenty of things to break as you traverse the interior battles. You also get a somewhat unique experience depending on which protagonist you chose, like smashing through a door or having to go through an underground passage, and those pieces of geometry exploding when hit add a fun element to combat. And on improvements made, it didn't go unnoticed that Ubisoft put time into making corrections that help fix the small details many have pointed out as incorrect from the trailers, such as the family crests on flags no longer being cropped. There are also several pieces of armor you can select for the characters that have intricate little details, such as a kunai attached to the shoulder or a red accent to the fabric that really makes Naoe pop. Yasuke's default armor set that you may have seen in the artwork and trailers was probably the best looking set I had access to, but I mostly wore a set with a stark red cross on top of a yellow backdrop due to its boost to his damage. I really like some of the armor sets in the game due to the fact that they made the characters look cooler and also added desirable benefits to their unique playstyles. I didn't dig into the transmog system they had previously confirmed, but I will definitely be using it in the full release. It seems to use this visualize menu option that I just didn't think to toy with during my preview. The armor swaps really enhance the visual presence of them both, especially Nawe, who I feel like just hasn't gotten enough screen time until now, and she may wind up being the more interesting character versus Yasuke. Speaking of being cool, this video is made possible by people like you watching right now. So if you're not subscribed, please consider it, as well as hitting that like button. If you want to support my independent gaming coverage further, you can do so on patreon.com/SafeStatePlus or by becoming a YouTube member. A huge thank you to the platinum backers like Christopher, Inner Machine, Philaroni, Savage, Spingetter, and the Scarecrow 121. Now back to the preview. You know what? Nawe was also a highlight from a storytelling perspective, and I really wish she had received more coverage in the lead up to Shadows. Her story is just a lot easier to get on board with than Yasuke's backstory, which takes some surprising liberties with his real-world introduction to Nobunaga, and, at least in the preview, fails to explain why he would remain loyal to people who appear to be treating him so poorly.
Your priests are free to move in these lands.
Thank you, Lord Nobunaga. You will not...
But your servant, Diogo, stays. He may yet prove useful to me.
Very well.
In these early sections, Yasuke is portrayed to have almost a sixth sense-like ability, which piques Oda Nobunaga's interest in Yasuke beyond the color of his skin.
Your black man has the instincts of a warrior. As he realized the danger you are in, his eyes found every threat in the room.
Yasuke's setup felt like it made a bit less sense, and it didn't help being jumped around to a later save. I wish I could have instead just played from the start, so of course I'll reserve judgment until I get to experience the full storyline.
Is that tyranny, Yasuke? No. No, it is conviction. They trust in their future with you.
Yes. And that belief makes you my samurai.
On the minigames, as someone who has done nature photography in my spare time, I really love the animal observations you can discover in the wild. You can sneak up on cranes, deer, or other animals for a quick sketch, and I really love this as an optional way to learn more about the wildlife in Japan. You can even pet the puppies you encounter on the streets of town, another nice touch for animal lovers like myself. But no, you could not murder them if you felt like being a terrible person today. Beheading a guy in the streets, that's a-okay. Hurting a future hamburger, sorry, but that's a no-go. Why Ubisoft thinks this is okay, but not that, I will never understand. Without spoiling too much, I did enjoy the mission we got to play also. I'll tell you this right now though, if you are a history buff, there are inaccuracies, such as characters dying in the wrong castle or in the wrong year. Ubisoft has already addressed this, saying, "Our intention has never been to present any of our Assassin's Creed games, including Assassin's Creed Shadows, as factual representations of history or historical characters. So if you're putting it all under a microscope, keep that in mind. I've been on board since Leonardo da Vinci literally made me a tank, so buckle up for a fun take on history yet again."
Tokubei? Where are your clothes?
It's you! From the Renkakai. Who sent you here?
I can understand why they made the changes they did, given the fact that it makes for a more interesting through line to the overall story. History buffs may like seeing important figures referenced, but I would not expect 100% accuracy here. But it still works for the game's plot. On the mission itself, jump ahead to the next section if you want to know nothing about a single mission in the game.
Apologies, my lord.
Okay, so it's a bit of a cloak and dagger storyline with a father using his son as bait. I like the thought-provoking way the entire thing unfolds. The entire sequence has some twists and turns I genuinely enjoyed discovering as they unfolded, and I did feel the heartfelt conclusion made this character a sympathetic foil.
There are those who will crave your power and wield it as their own.
Know your strength. Do not give in to them.
I won't. My father doesn't have to worry about me anymore.
But for the game, that's where most of my praise ends, because while those elements are good, and I could see some players latching onto any one of them, it doesn't do a ton to bolster what I feel like is the weakest part of the entire game: the combat and stealth gameplay. Narrow hallways hinder combat maneuvers, and the split protagonist system leaves both characters feeling incomplete as assassins. I'm left feeling like it just doesn't quite work as well as hoped. I like some of the combat abilities the characters had, like Yasuke's satisfying power move that kicks someone to the next province if they got in your way, or Naoe's ability to see enemies through walls and mark them as you began your stealth experience with her at the lead. But something as key as using eagle vision to mark targets through walls shouldn't be limited to only one of the protagonists, in my opinion.
That one won't be a problem anymore.
Similarly, having to switch to Naoe just to climb to the top of a tower and activate a sync point is unfortunate. It just makes both characters feel like they fall short with their toolkit, and because of that, it's sometimes more annoying to switch characters than it is rewarding. If I just want to play as one of these protagonists, I wish the game empowered me to do that. And on the combat front, let me be clear. It's not the worst combat I've ever played, it just feels awkward. Admittedly, I'm probably feeling this way for two reasons, and I'll be curious to hear from creators who were on site as to what they thought. But for me, when a game uses a parry or dodge system, and I'm using a streaming server for my preview, that window becomes even shorter and more difficult to hit due to latency. So for my playthrough, it was already difficult to see the telegraphs from these mid-game enemies that I'm fighting in a small space where the camera has nowhere to go, but it was compounded with the latency you get anytime a game is streamed. Or maybe I'm just bad at video games, am I right, commenters? Yeah, maybe I should get good. For Naoe, the demo also had some awkward restrictions that made my desired path inaccessible, and I was told I wasn't the only one who highlighted this as an issue. For example, after I took out all the targets, I wanted to backtrack to a rooftop and stay out of sight. But the Animus's blue barrier prevented me from going the optimal route and dropped me into a pit of bad guys, giving me two options: die and reset, or try and fight them. I opted for the latter because Naoe felt a bit underpowered compared to Yasuke, who felt unstoppable. Each has their own strength, with Yasuke being the perfect pick should you just want to go in and wreck anyone and everyone who got in your path, and Naoe is perfect for stealth takedowns and espionage missions. But picking quote-unquote wrong for a given scenario could lead to frustrating battles for some players. Overall combat felt okay, but it certainly didn't feel great at the same time. On the one hand, it was pretty hilarious to watch Yasuke punch smaller Ronin across the screen or see Naoe successfully execute a stealth takedown and escape unscathed. But the basics of combat can usually be ignored by brute forcing your way through almost every encounter. Most fights as Yasuke are probably meant to be executed like a pro, but you can kind of just hammer on your light attack button, dodge a little bit, and use power attacks to win your fights. Plus, I found the finisher animations got pretty old pretty quick and had hoped for a bit more variety. As Naoe, I felt underpowered, but it never really felt like I was in danger of anything other than being annoyed at my terrible stealth gameplay. Even if I made a mistake and alerted the whole camp, I could just hide on a roof and wait for the enemies to reset, or die to reload and try to loot that chest I found one more time. Knowing that it's almost impossible to fail as either protagonist made the gameplay mechanics feel like they needed more time to cook. I did appreciate that Shadows had a Pathfinder system that helped you find your destination. It was a huge help. Just generally speaking, I was happy to see just how different the missions played out as Naoe versus Yasuke. The most concerning part for me was the lack of things to do once I finished the main mission. While at the temple, which we encountered during the story mission, I did pray at all of the shrines and pick up a passive boost to my character. I hope there's more of that. Ubisoft also sent over some B-roll of other activities like archery that seemed fun, and I'd love to try them out in the full build, but I didn't immediately come across any of this during my session. When I did unlock the sync point, however, the game pointed me towards some points of interest that I would have explored given more time. The game seems to be really leaning on this objective board system, where you can climb to a sync point and highlight specific areas in the distance to peek at, or do so in the menu, or find a quest you want to tackle and send out scouts to find out more about the location, who will then give you a mark, and then you can go to the location and do something. And on that note, beyond getting to command the scouts, I didn't really get to see how I get more scouts or level up the scouting system, and I'm curious how all that works because it reminded me a lot of Brotherhood, one of my favorite Assassin's Creed games ever made. With this new objective-based system, I do have to say I much prefer naturally wandering around and finding something of interest, which seems less likely to happen. Going to some natural points of interest I saw at the top of the sync point, like a large boat in the distance or a rice field, resulted in some pretty uneventful findings. Typically on a massive map like this, you'd think you'd head towards a landmark and organically find interesting things. Beyond those, you'd have to mark, or completing story beats at the far-off locations, or I would expect to find compelling side quests at the far-off locations I noticed, but in this build, nothing really happened. I do hope that this is because of how the demo was structured and not indicative of the final product, because I was left feeling a bit underwhelmed. Curious about those people gathering rice? Well, if you go exploring, you'll find there's nothing really going on there. See that giant ship in the water? Maybe there's something cool going on there. Oh, I can't even swim to it yet. Maybe there's something in the nearby town. Well, there's a vendor, but he's pretty boring. Walking around town, I could pet the invincible dogs, but the amount of mayhem I could create was somewhat limited. Exploration resulted in only a few engaging activities to advance my character, likely due to being dropped into a custom level 25 build rather than progressing naturally. I really hope I'm seeing a bit more going on when I play in a normal setting. So, what's my big takeaway? I actually think the full game is going to be mostly decent. That's about what I can muster from my game instincts based off of a short amount of time with Shadows. It may even be great to longtime Assassin's Creed fans who've been hungry for a new entry into the series. It has mostly the same style of combat players have become accustomed to, and that's a mostly good thing, even if I wrestle with the camera a bit due to the level's design. There's a lot of quality of life issues such as transmogrification as an example, which have been addressed, but you'll still find that Assassin's Creed jank that has always been there. Sometimes things will just look a bit silly, and you'll be restricted in some ways that don't really make sense. But the story teases a larger plot involving the Animus that will be fun to uncover. Nawe is clearly tied to the Assassins in some manner, and I'll be interested to see how they allow Yasuke to make an exit given the fact that there's almost no documentation about what happened to him post-Nobunaga. One thing I have to admit though, there's enough there to make me want to play more, and time flew by as I explored Assassin's Creed Shadows. That has to count for something. I guess we'll find out together when the game launches this March. For more on my video game takes, consider supporting over on patreon.com/SaveStatePlus or becoming a member here on YouTube. Every little bit helps. You can of course also hit that like button and hit that bell to know when my content goes live for everyone. While I have you, be sure to check out my take on Mai and Street Fighter 6. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next one. If you were wondering why I couldn't decide how to say Yasuke, this is why.
Yasuke is the fight character.
What we know about Yasuke.
When we think about Yasuke,